Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Can you all hear me? Is it okay? Great. It's great to be back to Baltimore. This is my father's hometown. He grew up here, and we visited here often as children. My cousin, Julie Sharper, is about to give birth, so she may or may not come, and if she does come, she may have to leave very quickly. But it's just very gracious of you to have me here, and it's a real pleasure. I've heard wonderful things about this parish, this community, and your outreach, and so I'm very touched that you invited me to be part of your community this evening. I'm just going to get readjusted here with the beginning of our presentation, and as I'm doing that, I'm reminded that when I talk about the environment, it can get kind of depressing, can't it? I mean, when we look at our current environmental moment and see the kinds of things that we are facing, it can be a little heavy on our psyche. So I sometimes like to have an attempt at humor. So I'm not making any grand claims. This is just an attempt at humor. So this one involves a new priest who's just come to a parish, and he wanted to get to know his parishioners better. So he decided to go and meet them at their homes. So as he's going to door, he's introducing himself, and he goes to one door, rings the doorbell, doesn't hear anything, rings the doorbell again, and hears the patter of feet running across the living room, but no one coming. So he takes out his business card, and he simply writes on the back of it, Revelation chapter 3, verse 20, and puts it in the mail slot. And being good Catholics, we all know the Bible by heart, right? And so we know that Revelation 3:20 reads, Behold, I stand at the door and knock. Well, on Sunday, when the pastor is going through the communion harvest and the offering harvest, he sees his card. And there's just another scripture verse added, just the reference. Genesis chapter 3, verse 10. And being a good Catholic, the pastor looks up the verse and begins to smile when he reads, I heard the sound of you in the garden, but I was afraid, for I was naked. So I hid. That's that did you for a church. Oh, good. Okay. Just a little intro there. 20 years ago, I taught a course at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, on religion and ecology. When people heard this, they would often scrunch up their faces and say, what does religion have to do with the environment? The connection between football and faith, however, was never a problem. That was understood. It was, after all, the Fighting Irish. But this connection between faith and religion was puzzling. In the past few years, I've taught a similar course at the University of Toronto on religion and ecology. Physical stares happen less often, and the faces are far less scrunched. But now, thanks to Pope Francis, I may not have to answer this question again, at least I hope for a while. Last May, with the promulgation of the first papal encyclical on the environment, Francis, as you may recall, sent earth tremors across the speaking notes of climate change deniers worldwide and certain Republican presidential hopefuls in the United States. Entitled Laudato Si, Praise Be, echoing a canticle of the Pope's namesake, St. Francis of Assisi. This encyclical sparked some testy reactions. Quote, the Pope ought to stay with his job and will stay with ours, declared Senator James, and help me with the pronunciation, is it Inhofe? Thank you, James Inhofe, who chairs the Environment and Public Works Committee. Republican Catholic candidate for the presidency in the primaries, Rick Santorum, perhaps forgetting Pope Francis has a background as a trained chemist, declared the church would be better off, quote, leaving science to the scientists, and focusing on what the church is, quote, good at, which is theology and morality, end quote. And fellow Catholic Jeb Bush, also seeking to take up residence in the White House, told news reporters that he doesn't take economic policy from, quote, my cardinals or my pope, end quote. These, it must be noted, are representative rather than rogue voices. According to The Guardian, most Republicans in Congress deny the existence of human-engendered climate change and have actively resisted legislation limiting greenhouse gas emissions. And among Tea Party members, climate change skepticism runs near the 80% level, according to the Pew Research Center. Now, perhaps Francis's recent exhilarating visit to the U.S., with his historic address to a joint session of Congress, and his spiritually stirring visits with new immigrants, school children, prisoners, and homeless citizens, will change certain legislative hearts and minds on this issue. We live in hope. And did some of you have a chance to personally see the Pope in the visits here? I was just watching on television, but I found it very spiritually moving, very powerful, as did many people around me. In fact, just this morning I got an email from the Christian Reformed chaplain at the University of Toronto. And he says, I didn't think in my lifetime I would see a Christian leader who would combine social justice, ecology, and a great love for the poor in such a charismatic and powerful way. And then he concludes, hope with a Pope in 2016. Yet these initial reactions to Francis's encyclical speak to a lamentable but very serious impasse. Climate change science has emerged in the last 3 decades as one of the most vexed and contentious issues in contemporary scientific endeavor. From the muzzling of environmental scientists and the closing of ecological research centers in Canada to the censorship of leading climate change researchers in the United States, such as happened with NASA climate scientist James Hansen, politics have tinctured, tethered, and at times eclipsed scientific data on one of the most crucial issues of our times. Yet these skeptical reactions to the Pope do have a context. Beyond the contemporary climate change morass, they are somewhat understandable, given the fraught history of the science and religion dance in the West over the centuries, from the heliocentric crisis of Galileo's time to the creationist debates of our own. These responses point to some pointed questions. What role can or should a Catholic voice play in the science climate change debate? What credentials, quote unquote, does Pope Francis have in addressing climate change science? What are the potential benefits and pitfalls of the Pope using contemporary science to fashion a moral and spiritual argument? And lastly, can climate change science in particular, and environmental science in general, help call people of faith to a deeper understanding of their relationship to and responsibilities for creation? Tonight, I'll attempt briefly to explore some of these questions by reflecting on Pope Francis's use of science in Laudato Si and its reception by scientists, his continuity with pioneering environmental voices, his contextualization of science within a social and spiritual integral ecology, as he defines it, and his call for what he calls a cultural revolution, unseating what he sees as an unhealthy marriage between technology and a globalized economy. And the Pope here in Laudato Si is bringing together a wide array of research, both scientific and social scientific, to help frame the conversation. These are just 2 quotes from Laudato Si, and I understand that copies are available here tonight, and it's a great read. I'm actually thinking of buying this as Christmas presents for people. Mary Jo Leddy, an important spiritual writer and refugee advocate in Canada, said recently, this is the first time in her memory that she ever read an encyclical for spiritual inspiration. It's her daily reading. for meditation. The Pope writes, there are too many special interests and economic interests easily ending up trumping the common good and manipulating information so that their own plans will not be affected, their own plans. The alliance between the economy and technology ends up sidelining anything unrelated to its immediate interests. He also states, in this milieu, the most one can expect is superficial rhetoric, sporadic acts of philanthropy, and perfunctory expressions of concern for the environment, whereas any genuine attempt by groups within society to introduce change is viewed as a nuisance based on romantic illusions. The Pope is telling us a concern for the environment and a love for other creatures and a concern for those who are impoverished among us is not a romantic illusion. It's a deep-seated gospel invitation. And in doing so, he's creating a critique of a worldview. And so in light of the worldview critique that the Pope is inviting us to engage in, I have a little film clip with a little Canadian content. Any Canadians out there? My good friend Jane Coffey, who studied with me in Toronto at St. Michael's College, is here, so she'll appreciate this. This is a clip from the film The Great Outdoors, 1988, with John Candy and Dan Aykroyd, two Ontario boys. John Candy studied at a Catholic school in Scarborough, Ontario, the product of Catholic school education. The background to this scene is John Candy and his family have just gone back to this bucolic setting where John Candy as a boy grew up. He loves it, he relates to nature, he wants his family to have it. His greaseball, obnoxious brother-in-law, Roman, who's just interested in money and kind of self-aggrandizement, surprises him and comes up with his family without announcing his presence, and he's going to spend the week with them. So this conversation occurs just after Roman has arrived unexpectedly. Listen for the separate worldviews that each man represents as they talk about nature. And we'll think about that as we talk about what Pope Francis is inviting us into.
That was quite a surprise. I mean, yeah, you got me. And the whole week you'll be here. Okay. Oh, wow. Just something.
So anyway, you're an intelligent man. Thank you.
Make a good living?
Not bad. Get a good life.
Pretty good.
Answer me one question.
Sure.
Why the hell would you want to come up to a plant-infested no-man's land like this and live like a barbarian for a week?
You wouldn't understand.
Try me.
I have great memories of this country when I was a kid, you know, and I used to come up here with my dad, and I want the boys to have the same memories. Actually, I would look around you, Roman, for God's sakes. This is beautiful country here. Take a good look.
I'll tell you what I see when I look out there, if you want to know.
Yeah, I'm curious.
I see the underdeveloped resources of northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. I see a syndicated development consortium exploiting over $1.5 billion in forest products. I see a paper mill, and if the strategic metals are there, a mining operation. A greenbelt between the condos on the lake and a waste management facility, focusing on the newest rage in toxic waste, medical refuse, infected bandages, body parts, IV tubing, contaminated glassware, entrails, syringes, fluid, blood, low-grade radioactive waste, all safely contained, sunken in the lake, and sealed for centuries. Now, I ask you, what do you see?
I just see trees.
Well, no one ever accused you of having the grand vision.
Nope.
Maybe it's all for the best, while the ambitious scramble for wealth and power, the Chet Ripleys of the world are just able to lay back and casually stroll along life's path. I mean that as a compliment.
Oh, thanks.
The rest of us are all probably going to die of heart attacks and strokes long before you.
I hope so. Wouldn't that be great? Gee, just to see a bunch of people drop that you hate. You know, that would be something else, I'm telling you. My goodness me.
So, two contrasting worldviews, but one that sees nature simply as instrumental to power and wealth, and the other a bucolic appreciation of its beauty. The Pope is asking us to entertain a different paradigm than the one that Roman represents, but the one in which he calls our throwaway consumer society is largely built. seeing nature simply for its instrumental value. And part of the reason he's saying this is because all our great science, which can be so uplifting, can be manipulated and in Procrustean fashion fit into what he calls a techno-economic paradigm of destruction. And he's trying to bring climate change science into conversation with social science, with theology, with the church, with human rights organizations to say science doesn't have to play that role. He sees many positive opportunities for science and religion to dialogue. 2 quotes here illustrate some of this. Science and religion, he writes, with their distinctive approaches to understanding reality, can enter into an intense dialogue fruitful to both. He also writes, if we are truly concerned to develop an ecology capable of remedying the damage we have done, no branch of the sciences and no form of wisdom can be left out, and that includes religion and the language particular to it. For the Pope, what we need is everyone to be together, in a sense, all hands on the earth deck at this crisis moment. The poor, the marginalized, Aboriginal peoples, the wealthy, the scientists, the technicians, the politicians, the children. He addresses this encyclical, as you know, not simply to Catholics, nor to all people of goodwill. He addresses it to every person living on the planet. Now, I don't know if that includes the astronauts in the orbiting International Space Station. At the moment, they're not living on the planet. But when they come back, this is very relevant for them. But in my understanding, and other scholars can speak to this, I think it's the first papal encyclical to be addressed in this fashion. Why? Because our contemporary social, ecological, spiritual malaise affects every living person on the planet. The Pope takes climate change and climate change-related pollution very seriously. In his encyclical, he takes these issues head on, which is refreshing. There's no pussyfooting around. He goes right to the heart of the science and some of its devastating insights, directly utilizing some of this research on climate change. He looks at global warming, rising sea levels, the acidification of oceans, and the loss of biodiversity, of species loss. There's a leading professor of environmental studies here in the United States at Oberlin College in Ohio. His name is David Orr. Some of you may know his work. He wrote a very powerful piece, What is Education For? And he helps situate the environmental crisis. He says, each day we lose between 40 and 140 species of flora and fauna from the face of the earth, and no one knows the exact number. In many cases, areas are being destroyed in species before we've even cataloged them. That at the time of the writing, when he composed this in the 90s, we were losing tropical rainforests at the rate of 1 football field per second, an area the size of Austria per year. So imagine all of us going to the stadium where the Ravens play, going that 50-yard line, and then counting 1, 2, 3. Well, 3 times that football field area would have been destroyed of tropical rainforest, the cornucopias of life, the most densely held areas of biodiversity on the planet. It's this kind of data that the Pope explores through scientific analysis. He writes, he wants to draw on, quote, the results of the best scientific research available today, letting them touch us deeply and provide a concrete foundation for the ethical and spiritual itinerary that follows, end quote. Though the Pope studied chemistry as a youth and did work as a trained chemist, he also worked as a bouncer, I understand, so he's got a kind of diversified portfolio in terms of his CV. He didn't rely on his own science background in drafting the encyclical. To help him harvest cutting-edge environmental research, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences hosted an impressive workshop in May 2014, entitled Sustainable Humanity, Sustainable Nature, Our Responsibility, which brought together leading scientists and social scientists from around the world, including Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University's Earth Institute, Paul Crutzen, winner of the 1995 Nobel Prize in Chemistry, Hans Joachim Schellnhuber, director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and Naomi Oreskes, geologist and professor of history of science at Harvard University. Filtered through such scientific perspectives, the science sections in Laudato Si concerning climate change, biodiversity loss, destruction of the oceans, and the carbon cycle have a welcome level of sophistication. As Catholicism scholar Michael Higgins of Sacred Heart University in Bridgeport pithily observes, when it comes to climate science, the Pope did indeed, quote, do his homework, end quote. In delineating the science of climate change, the Pope writes, quote, a very solid scientific consensus indicates that we are presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climate system, end quote. He continues, quote, a number of scientific studies indicate that most global warming in recent decades is due to the great concentration of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxides, and others, released mainly as a result of human activity. Some scientists say completely owing to human activity. Others don't. The Pope continues, concentrated in the atmosphere, these gases do not allow the warmth of the sun's rays, reflected by the Earth, to be dispersed in space. The Pope's deep concern for scientific processes is reflected in his description on the carbon cycle. Quote, warming has effects on the carbon cycle. It creates a vicious circle which aggravates the situation even more, affecting the availability of essential resources like drinking water, energy, agricultural production in warmer regions, leading to the extinction of part of the planet's biodiversity. The melting in the polar ice caps and in high-altitude plains can lead to the dangerous release of methane gas, while the decomposition of frozen permafrost areas can be hazardous to people who make their livelihood on the permafrost. In light of these, the Pope reminds us that nothing is indifferent to us. And this is a statement that he uses in the encyclical. That means that no species loss, no ecosystem contamination, no refugee, no migrant struggling for a better life is indifferent to us as Christians. He talks about ecology and the need for ecological studies. Ecology studies the relationship between living organisms and the environment, he writes. It cannot be emphasized enough how everything is interconnected. Time and space are not independent of one another. And here you see his scientific sensitivity. And not even atoms or subatomic particles can be considered in isolation. Just as the different aspects of the planet, physical, chemical, and biological, are interrelated, so too living species are part of a network which we will never fully explore and understand. A good part of our genetic code is shared by many living beings. It follows that the fragmentation of knowledge and the isolation of bits of information can actually become a form of ignorance unless they are integrated into a broader vision of reality. And this is a key theme of the Pope, a wisdom tradition, not just knowledge and data accumulation, which he says can lead to a kind of ennui, a kind of listlessness and confusion. That his understanding of wisdom is that shared by many in the Catholic tradition, that wisdom takes the various cables of human creativity and knowledge and relates it to a larger whole. And he said, we are being, in a sense, fast-tracked in that wisdom tradition today because of climate change, because of the situation of our global economic system that leaves over 1 billion people in grinding poverty, because of the threats of nuclear war, because of refugees who are dying on beaches and in the Sonoran Desert south of our borders. We have to have a wisdom tradition that deals with this. And we have to have the sobriety, he says, and maturity to deal with it directly. And it's interesting how he can lodge these critiques with such love. I mean, I just found it very moving when he was in the United States, how he was exemplifying a kind of love, but not shying away from a courage to say what he had to say. And I think some of this comes from his humility. So part of his approach to science comes down to humility. As he says, once we lose our humility and become enthralled with the possibility of limitless mastery over everything, a la Roman in our film clip, we inevitably end up harming society and the environment. It is not easy to promote this kind of healthy humility or happy sobriety when we consider ourselves autonomous, when we exclude God from our lives or replace him with our own ego and think our subjective feelings can define what is right and what is wrong. And there are many aspects of this encyclical that speak to his pastoral sensitivity. You have a sense that he has spoken to many people as a mentor and guide, because he writes with great charity but searing insight. As one who spends some time in environmental studies, I've been impressed with the resonance of Laudato Si and its use of science with some of the classical themes in environmental science. One of the great figures in environmental thinking, as many of you know, is Aldo Leopold from Wisconsin. Aldo Leopold taught at the University of Wisconsin in wildlife ecology, studied forestry at Yale University, and became the father of environmental ethics, as well as the father of deep ecology. As a hunter and a wildlife ecologist, he evolved into this deep sensitivity of what he called the land ethic. And that land ethic is encapsulated in this brief statement. A thing is right when it tends to maintain the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. He says our ethics have evolved from personal ethics to include the social. He's writing in 1948 here, and he said now we have to embrace the non-human world, the biotic community. This is what the Pope is saying. And the Pope has the humility to say that the church, in a sense, is a Johnny-come-lately to the environmental movement. That we have to learn from Aboriginal peoples, from activists, from NGOs, from the Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew, the Green Patriarch, from other faiths who have been on the front lines of this environmental movement, and the scientists who valiantly and sometimes at the cost of their careers have been speaking out. He wants to bring them into the conversation about the biotic community. Secondly, he also talks about Aldo Leopold in the sense of we don't just need an environmental ethic, we need an ethics of the heart. For Aldo Leopold, a trained wildlife biologist, he says we have to learn to have love, respect, and admiration for the land. Unless we do that, we'll continue to use the land instrumentally and not celebrate its glory and intrinsic value. As you recall, when the Pope was in the United States, he talked about the intrinsic value of nature, building on what Aldo Leopold said in 1948. It's remarkable to see this confluence of American environmentalism and the papal visit to the United States. Also, another important voice in American environmentalism, in fact, the environmental movement at large, is Rachel Carson. This is a clip showing DDT being sprayed on people. Here's children eating to show how safe it is. This was a United States Department of Agriculture film showing that DDT was good. You know, while you're swimming, you need a little hit of DDT, you know, just to keep fresh. DDT being sprayed on people's homes even without their permission. And it was this kind of activity that prompted Rachel Carson to write Silent Spring. And she got a letter from Miss Olga Hutchins, who had a private bird sanctuary, and it had just been sprayed by DDT, and hundreds of birds went into shock and died. Later, Rachel Carson said, "It was your letter, Olga, that started it all." Interestingly, Rachel Carson dedicates this book to Albert Schweitzer, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the German theologian who served as a missionary, a medical missionary in parts of Africa. And the idea of a spring bereft of birdsong is what captivated her. Imagine going out in April here in Baltimore and not hearing the sound of robins and not hearing the sound of birds. That's what prompted the title, Silent Spring. But just as we compared worldviews between the worldview of Roman and the John Candy character in The Great Outdoors, we're going to see a contrast of worldviews from 1962 when this book was published. Some of you remember the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and how disruptive this was. One person who challenged the book was Dr. Robert White Stevens of American Cyanamid. In the year of publication, he gave over 120 addresses against the book. And here in a televised interview, he's going to explain a bit of the worldview of the modern chemist and the modern scientist as he understands it. You're then going to hear Rachel Carson speak about her worldview in an interview with CBS News at her home.
The crux, the fulcrum over which the argument chiefly rests is that Ms. Carson maintains that the balance of nature is a major force in the survival of man, whereas the modern chemist, the modern biologist, the modern scientist believes that man is steadily controlling nature.
Now, to these people, apparently the balance of nature was something that was repealed as soon as man came on the scene. Well, you might just as well assume that you could repeal the law of gravity. The balance of nature is built of a series of interrelationships between living things and between living things and their environment.
This actually is quite a story. PBS has done in their American Experience series a whole special on Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. And it's a wonderful viewing. And it shows that this is a collective kind of moment of courage. Many people worked hard to get this message out in addition to Rachel Carson. For example, Houghton Mifflin decided to publish it, but when they did, they got threatening legal letters from the Velsicol Company. But Paul Brooks, the editor, said, "We vetted this piece. We know that she's a reliable scientist. We're going ahead." When the New Yorker decided to publish pre-publication excerpts, they got similar threatening legal letters. They said the same thing. We're publishing it. We're doing our job. When it came out and caused a stir, CBS News decided to do an interview with Eric Sevareid and her at her home. You just saw a clip from that interview. 2 weeks before the broadcast, CBS News put out their publicity. Approximately 3 days before the broadcast, all the sponsors pulled out their advertising. We're not going to have our ads show. But CBS News went ahead and showed it. That night, watching at home was Senator Abraham Ribicoff of Connecticut. Now, I doubt Senator Ribicoff had read Silent Spring, and I doubt he had read the New Yorker excerpts. But he saw that interview with Eric Sevareid, and the next day he called for hearings in the U.S. Congress on DDT use, leading to the banning of DDT in North America. I call it a chain of courage. And this is what the Pope is inviting us to be part of this chain of courage of people who are fighting for a beautiful and sustainable life, who are struggling but also celebrating this moment in nature. This last clip is Rachel Carson in front of a special hearing in the U.S. Congress on DDT use. And again, notice her language and how she relates it to the American tradition of constitutional rights.
First, I hope this committee will give serious consideration to a much neglected problem, that of the right of the citizen to be secure in his own home against the intrusion of poisons applied by other persons. I speak not as a lawyer, but as a biologist and as a human being. but I strongly feel that this is or should be one of the basic human rights.
So just as Rachel Carson in front of the US Congress is showing a consonance between ecological integrity and basic human rights, the Pope in this encyclical is showing a continuity between an ecological understanding of integrity and societal cohesion. The response from the scientific community to this encyclical has been largely positive in what I have been researching. According to many environmental scientists interviewed, including those interviewed by the political news group Think Progress, and that includes Anthony Broccoli of Rutgers and Michael Mann of Pennsylvania State University, the Pope generally handled the science well and accurately in his statement. As Broccoli noted in a recent interview, quote, "Based on what I have seen of the science in the encyclical, most climate experts would find little to disagree with," end quote. While some scientists noted one or two minor technical shortcomings in the encyclical, one dealing with the carbon cycle and one dealing, as I alluded to earlier, with the human activity around climate change, it appears that the majority who've been interviewed in post-publication reports observe that the Pope has done well in handling this complicated science. And it seems, after all, they recognize this is an encyclical, not a peer-reviewed publication. Unlike professors, she doesn't have to publish or perish, right? Thank goodness. I interviewed a colleague at the University of Toronto, Danny Harvey. He's a climate scientist and part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the one that has prepared, with over 2,000 members, these reports and represent kind of the harvest, if you will, of leading climate change research. I asked him about the Pope's use of climate change. And then he said, it looks fine to him. But he said, what really is important to me is that the Pope is putting this into a moral and ethical context. He said, this is so needed. And he said, thank you, Pope Francis. For many scientists, they say the science is out there and any really intelligent person can go through it and construct the argument based on these reports. But what hasn't been done is people relating it to their religious, spiritual, and ethical traditions and saying this is a spiritual, moral, and ethical issue as well as a science and policy and economic issue. And that's what the Pope is doing. He's using this science to broaden the debate. And it's interesting, just as when the Pope comes to the United States and he speaks to Congress, after that speech, he didn't have lunch in hallowed halls, did he? He spent time with homeless. He spent time with the people who are normally not on the television screen. He extended our geographical map to include, through his trip, prisoners, homeless, people who are challenged with emotional issues, children in a school that was slated for closure. In the same way, the Pope is trying to extend through science our gaze and say that this is our issue. It's not just for the climate scientists and it's not just for the NGO activists. This has to do with God's creation. This is our business, and it's urgent that we do something about it. The Pope, though, is not a booster for science blindly. And he says, of course, we have to unite it with a tenderness and compassion. A sense of deep communion with the rest of nature cannot be real if our hearts lack tenderness, compassion, and concern for our fellow human beings. Everything is interconnected. So for him, part of the contribution of science is to the wisdom tradition of interconnection. Just as in business you sometimes hear about externalities like pollution or other negative effects, or collateral damage in a war, that doesn't hold with this Pope. In fact, he uses the term collateral damage. There is no acceptable collateral damage. There are no externalities in creation. It's not right for anyone to suffer unjustly, particularly the poor. And I know with John Hutt's presentation and also with Dr. Mary Evelyn Tucker's presentation, you will probably hear more of that accented. I wish I could be there for their talks. He talks about the positive aspects of science, but also its negative aspects. How it can be part of this paradigm of conquest, of a modern idea that we can control nature and, in the words of Sir Francis Bacon, torture nature for her secrets. The Pope says no, and he uses as his exemplar, not a scientist, of course, but St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis is not only his namesake, but his lodestar, his guiding visionary as he looks at environmental issues. He brings in issues of North and South, and he brings in the perspective of theologians from Latin America, such as Leonardo Boff, trying to incorporate not only ecologically scientific material, but economic and social issues. This is a picture of Haiti. It was once 60% covered in forest. Today, only 2% of the country still has trees standing, and there you see the boundary. These are images of 3 of the most polluted places in the world. And the Pope talks about how people are suffering from climate change in disproportionate amounts, depending on their economic status. This is the Yamuna River in India. And these 2 children are swimming. They're not dead. You can see the 2 kids there. But this is a highly contaminated river, still used for drinking and washing and other household purposes. This is what much of the world experiences. And the Pope had never been to the United States until this visit. He comes from a southern nation, the first Pope from Latin America, the first Pope to grow up in this kind of world. And he brings that experience of visiting barrios near Buenos Aires, of seeing people die before their time, particularly children. According to the United Nations, 40,000 children under the age of 5 die daily owing to contaminated water through gastrointestinal disease, incredible diarrhea, etc. That's 4,000 a day. This is a reality the Pope is aware of and tries to make us aware of in light of this environmental moment. So he's not simply a scientific ecologist. He's a social ecologist, and he's a Christian ecologist. He says we're not faced with 2 separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combining poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. He calls then for that integral ecology, which we mentioned earlier, which includes taking time to recover a serene harmony with creation, reflecting on our lifestyle and our ideals, and contemplating the Creator who lives among us and surrounds us, whose presence must not be contrived, but found, uncovered. This is the spiritual call that Pope Francis calls us to. And here, St. Francis is so instrumental. St. Francis helps us to see, he writes, that an integral ecology calls for openness to categories which transcend the language of mathematics and biology and take us to the heart of what it is to be human. Is science an essential dialogue partner in this debate? Absolutely. But does it need to have the hand-holding of other disciplines, including theology and faith, to get to wisdom? Again, absolutely. And so St. Francis becomes not just a namesake, but a model, an exemplar for this Pope. And St. Francis has long been dismissed in our tradition on his environmental teachings. Brother Sun, Sister Moon. Maybe some of you saw that Zeffirelli film. Remember that? Brother Sun, Sister Moon? He talked to Brother Wolf. He gave sermons to birds. I mean, if we saw a priest today going out and giving sermons to birds, we'd think, is he on a cell phone or is he nuts, right? I mean, what is this? As theologian David Tracy said, traditionally St. Francis in his ecological teachings has been placed somewhere between Sleepy, Dopey, and Doc in the pantheon of Christian saints. Like a real wingnut, a lunatic. You know, the option for the poor and the simplicity, oh, that's great. But talking to wolves? Are you nuts? Mother Earth? Brother Sun? Kinship with nature? Pope is saying, no, he's not nuts. Who's crazy? Who's the crazy one in a world where we are destroying that which gives us life? Where we are forcing, literally, thousands of species into extinction every year? Where we're contaminating the water that we need to drink? Who's crazy? The Pope is saying, Francis is not crazy. In fact, Francis has it right. He's not a lunatic. He's a gracious and wise docent on the path that we have to follow. I like this one. And this is where the social ecologist and the scientific ecologist embraces Scripture and the Christian tradition. Clearly, he writes, the Bible has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism, unconcern for other creatures. And here, again, in terms of landmarks, is an important note. This is one of the first encyclicals to address the welfare of animals in such a direct Christian way, one that is deeply spiritual and deeply grounded in a critique of a modern worldview. Just time for another attempt at humor, sorry, but maybe you've heard this one. There was, speaking of worldviews and animals, there was an avowed atheist, and he was hiking out in Yellowstone National Park, enjoying nature, just loving it, when he comes across a grizzly bear. The man panics and he starts to run, and the grizzly starts chasing him through the forest. And grizzlies, though big, can go pretty fast. And the guy is screaming, "Dear God, please help me." And God said, "Hello, this is interesting. You've never talked to me before." He said, "Yeah, I know, God, but could you help me? There's a bear chasing me." He said, "Well, what would you like me to do?" He said, "Well, I know I've not gone to church or anything, but could you at least make the grizzly bear a God-fearing Christian?" And God said, "Sure, it's done." So the bear stopped, the man stopped, and he's breathing heavily, thinking he's saved, and he sees the grizzly bear bend his huge head and fold his gigantic paws and begin to pray, "Dear Lord, for the meal that I'm about to receive, make me truly grateful." If you've got better environment religion jokes, please send them my way. I'll give you my email later. I need help. But this deep compassion for all living creatures, human and non-human, is something that also marks this encyclical. And he goes through the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament. And he writes, "These ancient stories, full of symbolism, bear witness to a conviction that we today share, that everything is interconnected, and that genuine care for our own lives and our relationships with nature is inseparable from fraternity, justice, and faithfulness to others." He continues, "God's love is the fundamental moving force in all created things." This is a cosmic Christ. This is a cosmic faith that's in creation itself. And here his work echoes that of a famous Catholic priest and geologian, an advisor to President Bill Clinton and Al Gore, Thomas Berry, who taught at Fordham University. And he wrote that the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects to be bought, sold, used, and discarded. And the Pope is saying something very similar, that we are in relationship and that all matters to us. Nothing is indifferent to us. This, as you recall, was a famous picture from Apollo 8 in 1968, Earthrise. In fact, in the Christmas message from the astronauts Anders, Borman, and Lovell in that year, they read from Genesis, and this was broadcast throughout the United States. But this was not the way the shot was taken. When it came into newsrooms, they flipped it to look that way. And they called it Earthrise. This is a kind of picture we can understand, as if we're on the surface of the moon looking at the Earth rising. But that wasn't the way the shot was taken. The shot was taken this way, with the command module orbiting, deracinated, with the moon to one side and seeing part of the Earth on the other. Everything floating in this mystical, cosmic, gravitational relationship. Where is terra firma in this? This is hard to relate to. It challenges us to think differently. It might get us out of a certain comfort zone. When we turned it to Earthrise, we felt more comfortable because we put the data into frameworks that we understood and we felt cozy with. The Pope is saying we cannot continue to do this. We cannot continue to put this data and this suffering into comfortable categories and forget about it. We have to see it as it is. And this takes courage, sobriety, but also joy and friendship. And this is a wonderful dimension of the Pope. I just want to conclude by reading some of the concluding thoughts and prayers of Pope Francis. He writes, "At the end, we will find ourselves face to face with the infinite beauty of God and be able to read with admiration and happiness the mystery of the universe, which with us will share in unending plenitude. Even now, we are journeying toward the Sabbath of eternity, the New Jerusalem, toward our common home in heaven. Jesus says, 'I make all things new.' Eternal life will be a shared experience of awe in which each creature, resplendently transfigured, will take its rightful place and have something to give those poor men and women who will have been liberated once and for all. In the meantime, we come together to take charge of the home which has been entrusted to us, knowing that all the good which exists here will be taken up into the heavenly feast. In union with all creatures, we journey through this land seeking God. For if the world has a beginning and it has been created, we must inquire who gave it this beginning and who was its creator. Let us sing as we go. May our struggles and our concern for this planet never take away the joy of our hope." And then he writes this prayer. "Father, we praise you with all your creatures. They came forth from your all-powerful hand. They are yours, filled with your presence and your tender love. Son of God, Jesus, through you all things were made. You were formed in the womb of Mary, our mother. You became part of this earth, and you gazed upon this world with human eyes. Today, you are alive in every creature, in your risen glory. Praise be to you. Holy Spirit, by your light, you guide this world toward the Father's love and accompany creation as it groans in travail. You also dwell in our hearts, and you inspire us to do what is good. Praise be to you. Triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe, for all things speak of you. Awaken our praise and thankfulness for every being that you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth. Seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life for the coming of your kingdom, formed in justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. Amen. Thank you.
Did the Pope write this entirely? Did he write 90% or 10%? And was there an active group helping him along the way?
Yes, if everyone heard that. Did the Pope write this? What percentage? And was there an active group helping him along the way? As far as I understand, there was a group helping him. Cardinal Turkson was one of the ones who was helping him along the way. But what I do hear and what I have read in talking to commentators is that the Pope really did write this. I think others, certainly gave him data and, helped him refine it. But he had the final written hand on it. And that comes through in the document, as you'll see. There's some beautiful touches. Like that line, "Let us sing as we go," like that's the Pope. His voice is certainly through this. So I don't know what percentage, but I do have a sense that he was the final editorial hand. He was the overarching envelope of this document. And it has a personal touch as a result. But I don't know percentages. Thank you.
Roland.
Doctor, one of the recent spins that we have been hearing for people who are in leadership positions and are denying the realities of climate change and the scientific information is now a new spin, which is, well, we can't expect the United States to be taking the lead in this, which I think is a ridiculous question, a ridiculous statement, but that's one that we've heard. The other one that you often are hearing now is, well, just if the United States takes initiative and leadership in fighting climate change and global warming, other nations won't follow, and therefore what we're doing is hurting our own economy while others will continue to benefit. Could you? I think from Laudato Si, there are some very important issues that really are counter positions to the one that we're hearing the new spin doctors take today.
Mm-hmm. No, thanks for those comments, and they're very relevant. I mean, that reminds me of what Canada's position used to be under the Conservative Party leader, Stephen Harper. He kept saying, well, Canada can't have an independent Kyoto-based approach if the United States isn't on board. But once the United States got on board and started making changes, he was left kind of naked. He still didn't want to do anything, so he had to find another excuse. So a second response to that, the United States can't take leadership on this. In Canada, the center of our worldview of oil and gas is Alberta, where the tar sands are. And as you may have heard, in the last provincial election there, they turfed the Conservatives, which is unheard of. And a socialist government is now in Alberta. I mean, that's unbelievable. I mean, I don't know what the U.S. equivalent would be, but if Rush Limbaugh suddenly became a Democrat and loved Obama, I mean, that might be on the level. I mean, you just couldn't believe this, right? And they're against one of the pipelines that's coming out of the tar sands. And this was a sacrosanct worldview in Alberta, oil and gas production. So, can the United States take leadership on it? Absolutely. If Alberta can begin to take leadership on oil and gas, the United States can. And in fact, people look to the United States for this. And China has begun to take charge of its solar production. It's now one of the largest, not the largest producer of photovoltaics in the world. They know they have a problem that they can't sustain in terms of pollution, air pollution in particular. So the Obama administration and China have been in dialogue about new initiatives. And there's great hope for the Paris meetings. Unlike Copenhagen, which were so disappointing in 2008, 2009, there's hope now that the United States and China can help bring heft to these conversations. I just read, I'm not sure, but I just read that the Pope has booked passage to Paris for these meetings. Don't quote me on that, I haven't double checked it, I just got this in my email. But this is certainly a reason he came to the United States. It's certainly a reason he spoke to the UN and to the joint session of Congress and met with President Obama. There's no doubt about it. This was very clear. He wants to influence the climate change negotiations in Paris because he says we need an international deal now. And we need the leadership of good-willed people here in the United States, in China, around the world. So, one of the great things about the United States is it can remake itself through the vitality of its vision and people. And the word can't, in terms of leadership, in terms of moral leadership, in terms of, I don't think that should be part of the lexicon here, personally.
Thank you, and I really enjoyed your essay in the Green Bible. You talked about how the church has been Johnny-come-lately. I'm reading a book by Mary Beth Lorbiocki, Following the Footsteps of St. Francis, the Ecological Teachings of Pope John Paul II. Hundreds of teachings, speeches, pronouncements since the 80s, oceans, rainforests, greed, economic critique by Pope John Paul II. Why hasn't his teachings been more emphasized and well known?
It's a very good question. If everyone could hear, a lot of good statements from John Paul II on environment, etc. Why have not, these been implemented, or why is it not more widely known? One reason is the infrastructure for implementing those has been undermined. After Vatican II, you had the proliferation, and many of you remember this, of justice and peace offices all over the world. Dioceses putting money into youth, into justice and peace, etc. All these offices springing up. Systematically, those have been closed, shut down, shafted. So statements like this in the flush of Vatican II in the early 70s would be implemented at Catholic colleges and universities through Newman Center clubs, through development and peace offices in Canada, or Campaign for Human Development offices in the United States. They would have a structure. The Office of Justice and Peace at the various dioceses would have people there implementing them like that. Those staffs have been cut, shrunk, kicked, and pushed and shoved. There's been a structural decimation of the dissemination of ideas in the Catholic Church. And that's one reason you don't hear about them. And this is something I think that the Pope is trying to address, and he has to address. The structural rehabilitation of our youth programs, of our social justice, and our ecological programs, et cetera. There's a lot of stuff happening there, but it's not codified and it's not being institutionally supported at these various levels to the extent that it was in a justice and peace moment after Vatican II.
Any more? A couple more? Yes.
Thank you. I wouldn't presume to speak for these folks here, but I presume, or I suspect that we're the choir and you're the preacher. But in my circle of family, friends, and acquaintances, they're all on the other side. And it seems to these folks, including my dear and sainted mother who passed away 2 years ago, that science and the facts and evidence don't matter. They're just convinced of their perspective, and I've heard it said that the Pope is a lousy weatherman. My question is, how do we as individuals try to move this ball forward a little bit down the field, because it's like an immovable object in a lot of ways.
No, excellent question. And I think, that's a very serious one. And one of the drawbacks and faults in some aspects of the environmental movement I've found, and I'm alone, is that there can be a sanctimonious dimension, a holier than thou. We've got the right answer, and we're doing all our recycling, and we're eating non-GMO foods, et cetera. There can almost be a kind of self-righteousness. And I think this Pope, in his humility and in his just genuine love, is trying to get away from that. And I think that's an important model. So in dialoguing with people who have a different opinion, I think it's important that we see them and value, and obviously we do with family members, but listen to them and be in kind of loving dialogue. None of us has the whole truth, but try to help them in a relationship see that you matter to me, I matter to you, what your ideas are important, but where is their ideology and where is their friendship? A key theme in this encyclical and in this pontificate is this notion of friendship. And here he's building on Gustavo Gutierrez's notion of friendship, which is a rupture among ourselves and a rupture between a friendship between ourselves and the divine. And this rupture of friendship is sin. And you can see that percolating throughout this document. Friendship is key. A loving heart, respectful, standing up where you have to, but still respecting the person you're talking to. and connecting with them and at least listening to them at a level that you can hear. An example of this, I have a friend who was the moderator of the Presbyterian Church USA, and he was on a hate radio show, and caller was in, and he was talking about immigration reform here in the United States, and this guy was very angry and insulting him. But my friend just took a step back, and he said to the caller, "It sounds like you've got a lot of suffering in your life." And he said, "Yeah, I lost my job," and he just pastorally talked to him. In the end, this caller ended up agreeing with my friend on immigration reform. But my friend didn't take the bait. In other words, he didn't respond in a vehement way. As a pastor, he listened. Okay, what's really behind this? And they had a fruitful dialogue. And I think some of this is just not taking the bait and stepping aside as that rush and torrent of anger and denial can go by, and then just step back and say, okay, let's talk. I know that sounds simplistic. I don't mean to sound simplistic, but this can be done on an institutional level. It can be done on a structured level as well as a personal level. Finding out how to do that is complex, but I think the Pope is trying to model some of this, I think, in his conversations with high-level UN and US officials, but also Catholic charity workers here in the United States.
And I'm going to turn to the other side for the last question for the evening.
Will Father Pope be there in the time for the Second Life of Christ? And will the encyclical on the environment, will it be healed for the time, in that time for the Second Life of Christ?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that this encyclical talks about is the mystery of God and the mystery of creation. So in terms of the future, we don't know, and in terms of, the ultimate contours of that future, we don't have a detailed blueprint. But I think what the Pope is saying, and I believe this as a Christian, is that that future, wherever it is, will be guided by love and accompaniment. And this is the great hopeful message of the Pope, but also of people of faith entering this conversation, particularly Christians. We believe that we are not alone. We have not been abandoned. We do not fly solo on this earth. The divine has made itself present in our soil, in our DNA, in our humanity, and said, I will be with you always. This is a great source of hope. When people ask me, Steve, you look at all the data, are you pessimistic? And I say, well, I might be pessimistic, but I'm hopeful. Because faith, hope, and love are gifts that the angels bring. And this kind of compassion is something that I feel very happy to be alive for from this Pope.
Beautiful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.